Well, Jay, another special episode of the podcast, and this one has Chris Dalla Riva. Chris lives at the intersection of music and data. He's been playing in bands and recording music since his teenage years. He's currently a senior product manager over at Audiomack, where he focuses on data analytics and personalization, and he's got a new book out.
He sure does. The book is called Uncharted Territory: What Numbers Tell Us About the Biggest Hit Songs and Ourselves. Outside of his job, he also writes a popular newsletter, Can't Get Much Higher, and has had work featured in The Economist, Business Insider, and NPR, among others. This book is really interesting, and the accompanying playlist is phenomenal, but I'll let Chris tell you about it. So without further ado, here's Chris Dalla Riva. Let it roll.
Stand by for transmission.
This is London calling.
Wake up! The revolution is at hand! Your morning coffee is on the air. On the air, on the air, on the air, on the air, on the air.
Standing by.
Your morning coffee, the weekly music news for the new music business. It's the highly curated, agitated, advocated, moderated, and liberated digital music information that you need to know. We are your digital music authority. And now from our studios in Hollywood, California, here's your hosts, Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart.
Chris Dalla Riva, it is so good to see you. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great. I'm glad to be here.
I just finished your book, and I really loved it. I rarely read a book twice, but I'll probably read this one twice because there's just too much stuff in there to unpack. I think the first time around, it's called Uncharted Territory: What Numbers Tell Us About the Biggest Hit Songs and Ourselves. And I think that was the key part, that ourselves. And I'd like to kick off this discussion with our mutual friend Will Page taught me about economics, that it's more about incentives and human behavior than maybe about money. This book isn't simply about charts. It's about us.
Yeah. I mean, that's I think a good summary of why I was always been drawn to economics and economic thinking. But yeah, that's the key thing I think about this book that I kept coming back to, is that you can use, the long and short is, I listen to every number one hit, and I work with data in the music industry. I built this giant data set about all the songs, and I wrote a data-driven history of popular music. And, you can use those songs to tease out trends over the decades. And that's largely what I did in the book. But I think the important thing to remember is that when you think of, I don't know, the biggest song while you were in high school, or when you were in college, or something you heard at your senior prom or whatever, that song, sure, it was being played in the background, but it likely stood for something bigger than just whatever the song itself was trying to say. And I think that was the important thing for me to remember as I went through all this stuff, is like, yes, I could use whatever song as a jumping off point to talk about industry consolidation or the evolution of song structure. But at the end of the day, because all of these songs were so popular, they probably meant something to a lot of different people. And to me, I think that's the motivating force in this book, is that songs are powerful forces that can move people. And they've been doing that for, thousands of years. I don't know. In my case, I'm talking a couple decades, but this is not new.
Yeah, absolutely. You hear those songs and it immediately takes you back to high school or college or your first girlfriend, boyfriend. It's so amazing how music has that power, right? You mentioned all of this data that you have and the research which you've done, and I find that fascinating. But you put together this playlist, and I've been playing it, and it's got, I think, close to 1,200 songs in there, which is the songs that you talk about in the book, all these number one hits. Were there any songs when you put together that playlist that were out of print or you weren't able to get?
Yeah, there's a couple number one hits that have shockingly not made it to Spotify or were not available or have come on and off. I think the most famous one was when I started listening, because obviously I only did one number one hit a day, so it took me years to go through all of them. When I started listening, Georgia on My Mind by Ray Charles was not on Spotify. And actually, like a lot of the Ray Charles catalog was not on Spotify. Now, I guess whatever the licensing issues were sorted out. So the Ray Charles catalog, thank God, is available. There are a couple that are still unavailable, but I would say that they're obscure songs. There's a song from the late 80s called Rock On by Michael Damian.
Yeah, sure. Was that the old
Uh,
David Essex?
Yes, it was a cover of the David Essex song, the Michael Damian version. No offense if he's listening. Not my favorite number one. I believe he was like a soap opera actor.
Sounds right.
Um, but yeah, the original version, the number one hit version is not on Spotify. And the other one that comes to mind in the late 90s, there was a girl group called Divine, and they had actually, I think a very nice number one hit called Lately. Has not made it to streaming. Now, of course, most of the stuff you could find on YouTube because YouTube seemingly has every piece of recorded sound in history. But yeah, occasionally, I mean, stuff comes and goes from streaming services. I know people talk about, the nice part about owning something is no one's going to beat down your door and take it away.
Yeah.
But even occasionally big stuff, like again, Ray Charles comes to mind. There was an Olivia Newton-John song that was not there for a while. But most of these songs are popular enough where they're on the services.
Yeah. One of the excerpts from your book that I pulled out, which I thought was really interesting, it says, technology doesn't just affect how we record, it also affects how we listen. We used to listen to vinyl records. We listened to cassettes, then CDs, digital downloads. Now we listen on streaming services. And I thought that was really fascinating as you talk about the configurations across this period of time. And I believe it covers like 1958 to 2025. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it's about the last 65 years.
Wow. Talk about how configurations have sort of affected the way we listen to music over those decades.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I feel like you don't think about often. It's like, well, the song is the song, whether I click it on Apple Music or I throw it on a turntable, it should theoretically sound the same, analog versus digital arguments aside. But formats, I think, dramatically impact the experience that we have with music. And let's take vinyl as an example. Just the other day, I was listening to Otis Redding's record, The Dock of the Bay, and I have a record player. I have a small vinyl collection of vinyl records. And there's a deliberateness when you're listening on a turntable, when you listen to a record on a turntable. It's like I'm gonna get 20 minutes ish of side A, and then I have to flip the record over and listen to side B. It's a very active listening experience. If I don't get up after 20 minutes, I'm gonna be sitting in silence. Also, when the record ends, I do sit in silence, and you sort of sit, and whether you're actively thinking of it or not, there's like a contemplative period after a record ends. Whereas now if I go on Spotify and click play on that same record, it's going to run straight through. I can do a lot of things in the background. I never really have to think about the fact that it's playing because I don't have to flip the record over in the middle. And also, depending on the settings you have on your streaming service, when I get to the end, it might just start playing related music. So you don't get that like reprieve or that moment of silence at the end where you're like,
Yeah.
all right, that's the record. Um, Physical media is definitely a more active experience. That's not to say that everyone was always actively listening. I mean, most people for the last 100 years would get their music from the radio, which is a more passive listening experience. But physical media doesn't force you to be a little bit more involved than the streaming music on streaming services does. That doesn't mean you can't listen actively on streaming services, but I think these things quietly shape how we interact with music.
It's a different experience, right? When you're listening to an AM radio like I did growing up, it wasn't about quality. It was just a great song. And the other part I'd love to hear you address is something, growing up, we would listen to radio and it would play Poco and Pure Prairie League alongside of Earth, Wind and Fire and Wild Cherry or whoever. And back in the 70s, we didn't know what these artists looked like. We didn't know if they were black or white. We didn't care. It was just great music. And as I'm looking through your playlist that you made, which is fantastic, by the way, I highly recommend everybody check out that playlist that you put together of all these number one hits. Talk a little bit about genre as we sort of go throughout time. And there was a time where it felt like it didn't really matter that much what the genre or mood was until it did.
Yeah, I think you're highlighting was a very interesting period on the radio. I was born in 1995, so my experience with radio is very, very different. In 1996, there was an update to the Telecommunications Act passed in the United States, which this sounds like a very boring topic, but it had far, far-reaching effects. One of which was back in the day, and I don't know the facts and figures here specifically, but there was a cap on the amount of radio stations a corporate entity could own. So because of that, you had very different programming in Kansas City than you would have in Austin, Texas, or New York or LA, and this led to regional hits. It led to stations in these markets having very different feels. After the Telecommunications Act in 96, it basically got rid of those caps. And because of that, you saw tons of consolidation in terrestrial radio. And now there's really like two companies, iHeartMedia and Cumulus, I think is the other one, that own tons and tons of stations. And because of that, if you go into Los Angeles and turn on the classic rock station, or you go to New York and turn on the classic rock station, sure, there's going to be some differences, but programming to a degree is now controlled nationally or centrally in a way that was not the case in the 70s. And I think because of that, we get these stronger demarcation lines across genre that didn't really exist when FM radio first became accessible in the 1970s. And I think you really do see it on radio, whereas you mentioned Earth, Wind and Fire. When I hear their song Shining Star, today you would never hear that on a classic rock station. And the fact that I'm even sort of suggesting maybe you could if they looked different, namely if they weren't black, sort of sounds ridiculous. But if you go and listen to the song, like of course there is a funkiness to it, but there's a guitar solo on the song that rips just as hard as lots of other 70s songs you'd hear on classic rock stations. And
Stryper covered that song, like did a heavy metal version of it.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
It's just a great song.
Yeah, there's lots of examples that, again, I think on the surface sound ridiculous. One that always comes to mind is Hot Stuff by Donna Summer. Like, Hot Stuff probably rocks as hard as all the other rock bands that did disco-ish songs in the late 70s. The Stones did Miss You. There's tons of examples of everyone rocking the disco beat at the end of the decade, but you would never hear Donna Summer on a classic rock station. Even though I think that song Hot Stuff has the qualities that many other rock songs of that era did. But genre, as I talk in the book, it's very wrapped up in race and gender and what the artist looks like. And I think it's good to be aware of those biases, even if they're working quietly in the background.
Well, that's the beauty of your book and this playlist. It's not based on genre, mood, format at radio. And that's what makes it so great, is that we're, for the first time, these things are all put together. Not only that, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. When I look at some of the early stuff, I think of A&R, artists and repertoire, and how that's evolved. It used to be, and you point this out in the book, that the first sort of rockers, in that rock and roll era in the mid 50s, late 50s, they weren't all writing their songs. In fact, I would say probably most of them were not. and talk a little bit about the evolution of the songwriter that you point out, whether it's, the Beatles or Dylan or whatever, and how it went from, sort of the Ricky Nelson, Elvis, that sort of thing into this new era of people writing their own work.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the most fundamental changes that I witnessed throughout this listening journey is almost anytime you look at songwriting credits today, the artist has a credit on that song, even if they're a huge pop star. And listen, I don't know how much they're contributing, and I won't claim that, you know, Dua Lipa or Justin Bieber has a huge hand in writing all their hits. I truly have no idea. But, 60, 70 years ago, things were really sequestered off from one another, whereas you would have someone who wrote a song, that song would be handed off maybe to an A&R person, maybe to an artist, maybe to a producer. Say the producer would find an artist, they'd record this. The producer would decide how we're gonna, make this song sound. If it's a country song, the instrumentation is gonna be different than if it were a rock song. And then the artist is gonna record it. That changes dramatically in the 60s. And what people usually point to is the Beatles. The Beatles start writing their own songs, and around the same time, Dylan starts writing his own songs in it. And it makes it so that if you want to be taken seriously as an artist, you have to have a writing credit on their song, your own songs. What I point out in the book is because I track this actually back to the 1940s, is that you start to see this emerge in the 50s with some early rock artists that like the Beatles would look up to, like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Eddie Cochran. So the Beatles were
Buddy
really,
Holly.
yeah, yes, exactly. The Beatles are part of a larger trend. They're certainly influential because they were just so popular, but it's a dramatic shift where like a band or an artist becomes a single creative unit. All right, we're going to write the song, we're going to perform the song, and in some cases, we're even going to produce the song. Uh, that's so common these days, but it was not common before, I don't know, 1955, 1960.
Yeah, I find that super interesting. There's a few sites and platforms that sort of break down what makes a hit song or how it was crafted, like Song Exploder or Hit Songs Deconstructed. What did you take away? Is there a formula? I mean, what makes a number one hit?
Yeah, I joke at the end of the book that if I discovered that, I would have just wrote the song and not the book because writing a book takes forever. So no, I mean I don't think there's a specific formula. Follow these steps, you're gonna have a hit. I mean, there's still some inspiration involved in this process. I think at the top of the charts, and these are very, very broad rules or guideposts, you're not gonna see something super strange or obscure at the top of the charts. For the most part, you are going to see things that sound similar to other things that are popular, that work within the same song structures of things that are popular. So if your goal is to top the charts, you should work within the structures that are currently popular. Uh, over the last 10, 20 years, that structure, at least in the pop world, has been dictated by our Swedish brethren like Max Martin and
Sure.
um, they have something that has worked consistently. And I break some of this down in the book. It's the verse chorus structure. It's the biggest chorus you could possibly imagine. It's very hummable melodies, danceable rhythms. These things are not, the thing is, even if you're aware of what they're doing, it's still very hard to do. I think the other thing that's pretty consistent across the decades, and this isn't even musical, is that often when something gets to the top of the charts, it's not on its musical merits alone. It's often connected to something else. Maybe the song is in a movie, maybe it has a very compelling music video. In more recent days, maybe it's inspired a dance on TikTok. It's very helpful if you give your song a boost that has nothing to do with the song itself, or it has nothing to do with the music itself.
Yeah,
And
like a
that's
cultural moment, something.
yeah, which is again, these I'm like trying to give people advice. They're like, well, this is very hard to execute on, but that's the truth of the matter. I mean, it's really hard to have a number one hit.
How long did it take you to put this thing together? Because it's a beast. As I'm going through it, the first time I sort of scanned over it, I said, okay, there's some, maybe not decades, but definitely some pieces of time. And then you sort of look at what's going on culturally,
Yeah.
technologically. all of those things. But as you sort of dig deep and peel that onion back a little bit, there's a lot more to it than one might think. And that's why I found it so fascinating. And once you get into the book, you can't stop. You're going through it. And thank you for putting together that playlist so I could sort of go, oh, I remember that song. And you sort of go back, and it really helps tie it all together. But talk about, geez, what went into your head? Like, why did you decide to do this, number one, and how did you do it?
Yeah, I think if I knew how long this whole process would be, I would not have done it from the beginning, but I didn't have some grand scheme. I wasn't, now I work for the music streaming service Audiomack, but when I started this journey, I was not working in music. I had just graduated from college. I was working in economic consulting. So I worked with data, but at the time I was also playing in bands. I like to write songs, record them, release them. And I was just looking for a musical outlet. And I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I came up with this quest. I was like, I'm gonna listen to every number one hit. And I was like, I'll start at the beginning. The Hot 100 started in 1958. Buddy Holly's Poor Little Fool, not Buddy Holly, Ricky Nelson's Poor Little Fool. And I would just listen to one song a day. Maybe I'd play along on my guitar. So, it was like sort of a nice little reprieve at the end of my day. I told my buddy about it. He was like, "Oh, I'll do that with you." So every day we would just text about one of the songs, and then we'd rate them out of 10. And I started just noting our ratings in a spreadsheet because I have always spent my days, for better or worse, working in spreadsheets. I just started adding more information about these songs, noticed some trends, wrote something up, and I sent it off to a professor that I'd had in college. And he was like, "Oh, this is pretty good. You should keep at it." So I did keep at it. If you were to just listen to every number one hit, one per day, it would take you, I think, between 3 and 4 years to get through them all, which is a long time, but it's one song a day. It doesn't, while I was doing it, it didn't feel like a huge lift. It's you just sit and listening to one song every day, which is sort of a nice ritual. Actually getting the book published took much, much longer because I'd never written anything. So I sort of had to build up an audience online, which I started posting on TikTok, and I started a
Sure.
newsletter. And then from there, I eventually managed to find a publisher. But end to end, it probably took 7 or 8 years to actually get this book out there, which is why I joked before, if I could just write the hit song, I would have done that instead, because that process is usually a bit quicker.
Yeah. One thing I noticed when I was going through the book, two themes sort of popped up, and I'd love to get your insights on them. And that is sort of gender and race.
Mhm.
And as the music industry sort of grew up, and as, our consumption changed, maybe from radio to, the long play album, versus the 45. And as you get into some of this thing, what did you learn about gender and race as it pertains to number one hits?
Yeah, I felt always a little bit strange when I would write about this stuff because I'm just a white dude, I don't have tremendous experience with racial discrimination or racial issues, but you really cannot talk about the history of popular music. You can't talk about the history of the United States in the last 65 years without talking about race and gender. And I mean, there are many, many interesting things that we see. I mean, you see in the 40s and the 50s, charts are very sequestered by race. Is like, if you are black, you are going to be on an R&B chart. If you're white, you'll be on the country chart. You could also make the pop charts. And then in the 60s, we start to see more black artists cross over, partially the doing of the popularity of Motown. And I mean, we see similar things with women, is that something I talk about in the book is that women have always been involved in music. I mean, that's not a shock, but for a very long time, we're certainly sequestered to a role as a singer. Um, you can think of women who are singers going back very, very far, but for hundreds, thousands of years, I mean, women were limited in the musical roles that they could play. One thing we see in the data is that for a long time, women would not get songwriting or production credits, or sometimes we're not even allowed to write and produce their own songs. I mean, there's old stories of Joni Mitchell saying that she produced these records, but they would make some guy sitting there because that was not a thing that women did. And we see a dramatic transformation where now there are still significant issues in this area, but women are much more likely to be credited as songwriters these days than they were 60 years ago. So there's been a lot of great changes. At the same time, we mentioned it before when rock and roll first started, it was a sort of like a almost egalitarian art form in that there was a lot of crossover between races. You can find lots of old New York Times articles about people not liking how this music crossed racial barriers. But then by the 70s, we really do see rock music become segregated again. And this is where in the book, I talk about radio a lot. Any black artist that you think of that could have been said they were making rock music is usually sequestered to an R&B station or a different station. So these, it's a push and pull. We've seen dramatic progress in terms of uh, how we think about race and how we think about gender, but there are still issues that lurk in the background. And I tried to trace that stuff the best that I could from my perspective, because like
Yeah.
I said, you can't ignore that. I mean, it's just part of the story.
Yeah, I thought you did a good job with that. And I recently watched the Sly and the Family Stone documentary, and it really focused on the fact that that band was multiracial and they played multiracial shows. And I remember reading about the Beatles, and the Beatles would say, we're not going to play any segregated shows. And they played
Yeah.
with artists of color and things like that. And I thought you did a good job pointing that out in the book. One of the things I noticed when I was going through the book, and I'm curious if you notice this too, is some of this music that we grew up on is now being sampled,
Mhm.
interpolated. There's cover versions. It's in some ways being, what's old is new again. It's being brought into today's popular music. Did you see any of that as you did your research?
Totally. I mean, I think one of the things that digital streaming services have made possible is like the past is just so accessible in a way that I sort of make a joke in the book. If it was 1980 and your grandfather mentioned some old big band record to you and he didn't own it, it's like it could take you a long time to find it if you could.
If ever.
Yeah, and I mean now you can mention something from 1935 that's super obscure and I could in my pocket I have the entire history of recorded music. I think the past it makes the past very accessible and because of that we do see artists who you know, they use ideas from the past again, whether that's through sampling or interpolation. These ideas, sampling is new-ish or newer.
Sure.
Interpolating riffs and lyrics is not new. I mean, that's been going on for hundreds of years. But I think it's easier than ever to track these things. Whereas, if Bob Dylan remade some old folk song, your average American might not know what that was. Now, again, because of all the musical technology we have, how accessible all these things are, it's really easy to track when someone has gotten an idea from somewhere else. But that's part of the music making process. I mean, it's an interchange of ideas across between people across decades. I think it's generally cool. I think there's some lazy ways to use those tools, but there is some really cool stuff too.
Well, you would know, as a singer-songwriter yourself, how has your research and listening to all of this great music and talking about it and digging into it, that's had to affect the way that you write and record in some ways.
100%. I say there like you start to notice trends, and one trend it's probably the thing that gets shared online that I've written about the most is that there's fewer key changes in popular songs these days. The big one, not that there was really sophisticated key changes for decades, but the big one for a long time was the last chorus. We go up a half step or a whole step, and it sounds glorious. Like, the end of Living on a Prayer or I Will Always Love You. But I was aware of this trend that there are fewer songs with key changes. So a few years ago, I was like, whatever song I write, I'm going to put a key change in it just because fewer people were doing it. So that was the one thing that I became aware of when you're looking at trends. It's like, oh, when I'm writing, I could either be part of whatever trend is going on, or I could make a left turn and try to do something different. I think that's putting a key change in a song is a good example of something that I thought was, a little bit of a left turn, but I think it made the song that I was working on better. So that's how I've used it. It's certainly made me sharper. I mean, you listen to a lot of very songs that were very popular. You think about melody in new ways. I think I'm a bit more discerning about what works and what doesn't. That was part of the reason I started doing this. I was like, oh, maybe I'll become a better songwriter. I think I did, but that's not captured in the book as much.
Chris, I love the book. Like I said, I rarely read a book twice, but I'm definitely going to go back into this one. And I love that the playlist that you put, and I believe you even have a data set. I haven't checked it out yet from the book that you offer on your website too. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I made the entire giant number one hits data set public on the website, chrisdallariva.com/uncharted. And also there I have playlists available for before the book comes out, I'll have all of these done, but I'm doing one playlist for each chapter. So even if it's
Nice.
not a number one hit, it'll be something you could quickly look up. I think there's a note at the beginning of the book. I say, you could read this book without really knowing about any of the songs, but you should listen to a couple songs along the way.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's what's missing from a lot of these great books I've read about artists is that they talk about these songs, and there needs to be a companion piece to that. The book comes out November 13th, correct?
Correct.
Listen, tell people where they can learn more about you and the newsletter and the book and the work that you do.
Yeah, I like to think I'm a very easy guy to find online. Most platforms I'm C Dalla Riva Music, but if you search Chris Dalla Riva, I will come up on basically every platform. I'm most active on TikTok and Instagram, and I have a weekly newsletter called Can't Get Much Higher where I write about music and data. I try to interview people in and around the industry. And the book will be available. It's again called Uncharted Territory, What Numbers Tell Us About the Biggest Hit Songs and Ourselves. It will be available everywhere online. So you won't be able to walk into your Barnes& and Noble and pick it up, but Barnes& and Noble online, Amazon, Walmart, Bookshop. I'm still finding all of the websites that it's available on. So the publisher's done a good job at making sure that it's easy to find. And if you can't find it, if you reach out to me, I will get the book in your hands.
That's great. Chris, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I hope we can do this again.
Yeah, this is so much fun. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
You've been listening to Your Morning Coffee, the weekly music news program for the new music business. Join Jay Gilbert and Mike Etchart next time for the digital music news you need to know.